This is an AI generated image. And for me, it conveys much of the problem around instructional design and AI currently in higher education. Um, we are largely trying to use AI to drag along an older pedagogical model, which has had issues for many, many years, rather than try to build an entirely new model using the unique affordances of AI. Um, I suspect that going forward, we're going to see, again, there are going to be attempts to accommodate AI to the older pedagogical model that many of us are familiar with. But in the end, the most fruitful approach will be recognizing that we really need to adopt an entirely new model that incorporates the principles of evidence-based learning along with AI technology. And there's even um, a name that's being put forth by called generativism. When the term was coined by Mary Presh of the University of Manchester, who is an acknowledged global expert on on AI and pedagogy, whose work on generative AI in education. She has a book out, and I strongly recommend that you look at it. Next slide, please. So I don't really think I can talk about instructional design in higher ed as if though it were a monolithic thing. Instructional design, like everything else, like assessment, exists within the context of culture of an organization. And so when we're talking about AI and instructional design, we're talking about various models which relate to the culture of a particular college or university. I work with the AAC&U as an advisor to various community colleges around the country in terms of helping them envision what their policies around AI should be. And I've gotten a very good snapshot of what the landscape looks like right now. And I've defined them in three categories, which I call ostriches, crows, and falcons. The ostriches are the schools which are simply trying to ignore AI as much as possible. These are often the schools that see AI, to go back to a quote from Ruth's work, as just another layer of responsibility. We've already got a really plate full of things already. We'll get to it at some point, but right now we have other more pressing matters to deal with. As you can imagine, this is not a very constructive approach, and these schools, to the degree that they acknowledge AI at all, see it as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity to reinvigorate their attempts at promoting student success in a variety of mediums, as well as the work of their faculty and staff. The second category are what I call crows. And the crows are more positive. They're poking around with it. They're putting together policies. They're not moving at a hyper speed, but they are beginning to have conversations. Crow schools usually have some sort of recommendation about AI policies for syllabi, and are probably moving towards some sort of institutional policies around AI. But by and large, have not really experimented with it as a tool for teaching and learning, apart from basically using it to generate syllabi or rubrics, and not really see as a tool that can create entirely new forms of learning artifacts. And then finally, there are the falcons, and the falcons are a very rare breed indeed among colleges, at least at the moment. Falcons tend to be those schools where there is a culture of experimentation around educational technology and are beginning to explore using AI to create a number of things, such as tutoring chatbots, generating a variety of experiential learning experiences, simulations, things like that. They're not just saying, how can we use AI to create the stuff that we've already been using, but how can we use AI to create entirely new things? I'll give you an example of one way in which I see AI impacting our educational experiences. In my role as a learning designer, I've spent probably about 20 years creating short interactive simulations for learning. And, this is a very satisfying activity for me, but it tends to create a really good simulation for learning and to think of all the potential choices that a learner might make around a topic in a scenario can be very time consuming. Using AI as an instructional design assistant, I'm able to accelerate the process of building simulations much more quickly than I ever did before. The image generation functions in AI alone saves me an enormous amount of time and effort from whereas before I used to have to scour through image collections to find the ones that I really needed, and almost invariably did not find what I was looking for. What I needed was an individual artist. Earlier this week, I shared out with my colleagues 10 simulations I built that aligned with the 10 core competencies required of Massachusetts nurses. This was intended as a tool for our nursing students to practice the 10 core competencies required by the state. A few short years ago, to create those 10 simulations, it would have taken me several months, assuming I even had the time in my schedule to build them. This time it took me about 48 hours. And in terms of the resource and time alone, that is revolutionary, which means that simulation creation and deployment can become a much more everyday part of various types of learning ecosystems for students. Clark Aldridge, who is a pioneer in the use of simulation for learning, said years ago that one of the problems with our current traditional model of education is the emphasis is entirely on learning to know rather than learning to do, because that's the approach that's the epistemology that we're comfortable with. We educate students to know a lot of things, but whether they can actually do or apply these things is something secondary. We now have the ability to create a model that only reinforces people's ability to learn how to know, but we can learn how to do through such things as interactive textbooks, which we can now create with much greater ease than ever before. That's, to me, it's very appealing. Next slide, please. Recently, there was a survey taken to assess, what instructional designers are thinking about in terms of AI and how they see the future in the next couple of years. And here are some of the things that came up. They see greater role diversification in instructional design, and this echoes what's been said before about the evolving role of the assessment professional. I think all of our key roles, all the roles that we play in the learning ecosystem, instructor, assessment professional, instructional designer, are going to be altered in the next couple of years. And I think the people who understand how those alterations will occur will enjoy the best career benefits as well as benefiting their institutions. There's also a belief that there's going to be a shift towards performance-based success metrics. And this is significant, again, because we can create more tools which enable students both to practice certain skills, but tools that also assess what they're doing while they're practicing those skills. To me, the ability to create learning tools which are watching the students while they perform them is one of the most exciting things possible. Years ago, I observed a friend who had built a cybersecurity training program which put the learners through a series of cybersecurity scenarios. And the system tracked not only how long it took them to solve a particular problem, but whether or not they were able to solve it in a completely satisfactory way. In other words, it wasn't simply black and white. Some solved it in a partially successful way, and some did it in a completely successful way. And the system was designed to be able to capture that data, which again, to me, is one of the most exciting things where assessment and analytics come together. But in the past, it took a lot of resources. Now it won't require as much resource and efforts. All it really requires is that we understand that we can now do these things that we couldn't do before. Increase in instructional design productivity. Again, as I indicated with the simulations that I mentioned, before I was able to do in a couple of days, which would have taken me before a number of months. And that alone may be the single greatest impact of AI on instructional design. And questions about challenges in SME collaboration. One of the issues that you often face in instructional design is, are the subject matter experts available to really talk with you at length about their subject matter expertise in ways that don't interfere with them doing their own work. One of the earliest applications of AI to instructional design has been to allow instructional designers to interview subject matter experts and record it, and then use the AI to analyze the conversational data and provide thorough suggestions on how the information can be applied. So in terms of saving time for the subject matter expert, that in itself is a really impactful thing. So I think right now is the most exciting time, and certainly in my life, to be in instructional design. I think it's, of all the fields, it's going to probably evolve the most, but we have to understand the possibilities of it as well. Again, one of the problems with any new technology is that it takes us often a couple of years to understand its full affordances before we begin to use it in new and interesting ways. And I hope with AI, certainly some schools begin to move forward more quickly. I've written an article that helps illustrate some of the ways in which instructional design can move forward with AI, and I'm going to drop it into the chat there just while we're talking. The other thing that I do, as I've been in my role as director of professional development, I'm very big on promoting professional conversations. I created a LinkedIn group for AI in education back in 2020 because I've been looking at AI as a tool since at least 2018, and I gave my first talk on AI for learning in front of an assessment group in 2019 because I came to AI as an educator with a concern that it wasn't really possible to provide meaningful feedback to writing students in a short period of time. Because as a writing, I started out in higher ed as a writing teacher about 30 years ago. And as any of you among you who teach writing know, the student whose paper is on the top of the pile gets the best feedback. And the student at the bottom of the pile gets, I really like your font choice. I mean, you're just too tired to say anything at that point. So there's an equity issue in terms of the assessment quality. The other issue is the speed. It takes a lot of time to read and compose thoughtful comments that students might find useful in revising their work, even for an experienced writing instructor. A well-designed AI using a rubric, guided by a rubric, can generate high-quality feedback to a student in a very short time. And for me, as a writing instructor, it's really revolutionized my ability to support my students. So these are some of the ways in which I see it going forward. Next slide, please. So one thing I see, obviously, is greater productivity. And I hope that leads to greater visibility and appreciation for instructional designers who often feel invisible at their organizations. I was one of the people who hoped that after that, as a consequence of the crisis of COVID, instructional designers might get more visibility and appreciation because they were so essential in helping build all those emergency online courses during the COVID period. I was a bit disappointed in that insofar as afterwards, there seemed to be a quick return to the status quo and instructional designers being told to go basically back to the barracks. I'm hoping now that there's going to be a greater visibility for IDs going forward. I think we're going to see a greater diversity of learning artifacts. I think we're going to see a much more interesting interactive artifacts than we ever created before. And I see the emergence of a ecosystem of learning artifacts that is independent of the classroom. In other words, one of the things about AI that schools should be thinking about is creating a library of learning artifacts they're interactive and powerful, which students can use during and after they've completed a course. Because one of the biggest problems we face is that once a course ends, the instruction ends, and the learning support largely ends, which allows the forgetting curve to kick in. That's a problem we've never really tackled in higher ed. I think we can do it now with AI. For example, Devin Walton built a tool for retrieval practice, which enables a person to identify a topic that they want to get emails on regularly and quizzes on, so that it helps reinforce their knowledge and so that it doesn't decay. I think something like that should become the norm for learners in any areas, whether it's academic or professional education, particularly in demanding areas where there is so much to learn and so much new information to learn. So those are my 3 predictions about where instructional design is going to go. I will drop in, the last thing I will drop into the chat box is a link to the LinkedIn group on AI for education, where I and several others share a lot of quality information on where AI is in education and learning and where it's going.